Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, or welcome to my YouTube channel if this is the first time you're seeing one of my videos. My name is Jan, also known as Sydney Plant Guy, and this channel is all about growing large aeroids indoors. Every once in a while I pop a Q&A opportunity into my community page here on my YouTube channel, and I give you the opportunity to ask me any questions, and in this video I will address some of the best ones. This is the third time I'm doing a Q&A, so please check out Q&A number 1 and number 2 in case your question has not been answered in this video specifically. Chances are I have already answered these questions in a previous video. And I'm planning on doing these Q&As maybe every couple of months, so feel free to subscribe and keep an eye on my community page to make sure that you're not missing out on the next opportunity to ask any questions. Also, one more thing I wanted to let you know is each question is going to be turned into a separate chapter on this YouTube video. So somewhere down below, you should be able to really conveniently skip between the questions and really just watch the parts of the video that you are interested in. But of course, feel free to watch the whole thing if you want to learn all about my approach to plant care. Question number 1. Have you ever been overwhelmed by the plants? How do you deal with it? How do you decide which plants to part with? Well, definitely. I have definitely been overwhelmed with all of the plants in my apartment a lot. It's a constant thing, actually. You know, I'm always tossing up between, oh my God, should I get another plant? And I have way too many plants. I need to get rid of some. So it can sometimes be overwhelming. I think if I get overwhelmed, it's not necessarily because of the amount of plants that I've got. I feel like I don't have a whole lot of, I have a lot of plants, don't get me wrong, but I'm definitely a quality over quantity person. So while I have a lot of plants, most of my plants are really, really large. And I think the maturity thing is something that overwhelms me a little bit more than just the sheer amount of plants. As these plants mature, you know, they just get so large and take up so much space. So the problem really comes in with finding spots for them in the apartment where they're going to thrive. I'm not really overwhelmed by the actual plant maintenance part. I think watering my plants is pretty easy for me, and we speak about it in a little bit more. Pest treatments is okay as well because I try and keep on top of it. I'll try and not have any outbreaks. So from a care perspective, really, I don't mind having so many plants and having these large plants. A large plant isn't any more work to actually water than a smaller plant, but it sometimes gets overwhelming when I try and fit them all into my apartment without making the apartment look absolutely convoluted with plants, while still making sure that every plant gets the conditions that they really like and deserve. So that usually gets overwhelming for me. I personally have no problem parting with plants that don't spark any joy. So you know, because all of my plants started growing so large, I really need to prioritize which plants I keep and which ones I don't. So if I look at a plant and it doesn't spark any joy for me, then you know, I'll give it away. There's no point in a plant taking up a lot of precious space if I don't enjoy it. And normally if I haven't posted a photo of a plant, if I haven't spoken about a plant, it's probably a sign that I don't really like that plant. So, you know, sometimes I just look through my camera roll and I'm like, hang on, this plant is nowhere to be found. Clearly, it's not sparking that much joy for me. Question number 2, is there a plant you don't already have that you have to have? I don't have to have any plants. I think there's definitely some plants that I would like to have. Now in Australia, it's a little bit tricky because we can't just easily import plants from overseas because of biosecurity laws. For the average person, it's basically impossible to really import plants. So the plants that we've got in the country are usually you know, tissue cultured, or they were imported a long time ago, or they somehow made it into the country. So we are very limited with the species that are available. Once a species does become available and it is available through tissue culture, they actually become fairly inexpensive. So there's pros and cons, right? Like, I mean, because of the biosecurity laws, we just do so much more tissue culture. But there's definitely some plants that I would like, but obviously I can't import them. And then if that, for example, let's take Philodendron El Choco Red or Philodendron Luxurians, I would really love those to make my velvet philodendron collection complete, more or less complete. I don't think Luxurians is in the country. I think El Choco Red is in the country, but the last time I saw them being sold, it was like 1.5K or so for like a leaf, right? That's silly to me. I don't need or want that plant that much, like not 1.5K much. So if that plant would be $100, I'd totally get it. But until then, you know, I'm very happy with the plants that I've got. As I said earlier, quality over quantity. I don't have the desire to go and buy a new plant every week or so, because the plants that I already have, they're giving me enough joy. They're growing. They're giving me new leaves every week. So I don't have the desire to buy more and more plants to overcompensate for the lack of growth or something like that. It's quite the opposite. I get overwhelmed with just the growth that I already have there. I feel like adding more plants to the collection would actually make it overwhelming. So in a nutshell, I don't have anything on my immediate wish list. There's no plants come at a reasonable price that I would love to add to my wish list at the moment. Next question. How do you care for anthuriums, specifically watering anthuriums? Well, pretty easy. Most of them are in the IKEA cabinet, and the IKEA cabinet is really consistent in temperature, humidity, airflow, and so on, right? Because it's an enclosed little environment. The humidity is pretty much always above 90% without even using a humidifier, just because of all of the plants within the enclosed space. There's constant airflow, and they have a consistent light, right? So my grow lights turn on every day at 7 and turn off every day at 7. So they get 12 hours of light every day. So because it's really consistent, I also have a very consistent watering schedule, which is once a week. I water them every Saturday. I take them out of the cabinet, I water them, and then I pop them back into the cabinet. So pretty easy, because I know that it's not subject to so many fluctuations in the environment because it's in an enclosed space. I know that I pretty much can't go wrong with watering it every 7 days. Obviously, keep in mind, it really depends on what the conditions are in your IKEA cabinet. If your cabinet is maybe a bit cooler because you live in a cooler country, then maybe you have to reduce the water frequency. So don't necessarily stick with the exact 7 days. That's just what I do. But find your rhythm. But then if you know that your environment doesn't really change, then your watering schedule should be pretty similar every week as well. They're in my chunky airwood mix, and they just have a layer of sphagnum moss on top. So really all I do is I take them over the sink, I water them thoroughly with water and my normal mineral fertilizer, GT Australia Foliage Focus, and I water it until all water drains out the bottom of the pot, and then I let them drain for maybe 30 minutes and I pop them back into my IKEA cabinet. That's as easy. Anthurium roots really don't like drying out, and my mix is pretty chunky, so I feel like there is no concern to overwatering my anthuriums at all. Which kind of leads to the next question. Explain your weekly/daily watering/plant care routine. I feel like that could take up the entire video, so maybe that's like a separate video I should make where I just take you along on my watering day. But pretty much in a nutshell, I don't have a specific routine. I definitely have certain days where I make time to water, but ultimately, to me, it's all about checking my plants almost on a daily basis. I mean, I know if I watered everything today and I checked, then I don't really need to check again tomorrow. But, you know, in the morning, I make myself a coffee, I walk around the apartment, I look at all of my plants, and I just really assess whether any of these plants need anything, if there's any pest issues, or if the moss pole has dried out and so on. So I really just do that on a daily basis, because sticking to a very fixed schedule is flawed in the first place. You can't expect your plants to grow in the same, or like use as much water in winter when it's hardly growing and it's cold and dark outside than in summer, where middle of growing seasons and it's like 35 degrees. Of course, you'll need to water more frequently in summer than in winter, and ultimately there aren't these defined breaks, right? It's a spectrum, the whole, like it's a continuous change. Like it's not one day you water once a week and then the next week you start watering twice a week, right? It's like a slow, gradual change in watering as the seasons gradually roll in, right? So yeah, it's kind of like really just learning how to look at your plants, pay attention to your plants, and pick up on the signs that your plants give up that they potentially need water, or picking up on the signs that a plant might actually suffer from pests and so on. So I think that's really what I learned over the last 3 years, and that's what I apply almost on a daily basis. I don't have like a checklist where just like, oh, Adansonii every Saturday and so on. But of course, they kind of start following a rhythm where it's pretty much weekly. So I do most of my watering on a Saturday, but I'll definitely take you along one day and kind of just show you exactly what I do and how I assess it and how I do my watering. It's just a bit of a challenge to film all of that while actually doing the watering. It already takes me like 2-3 hours as it is. So when I take you along, it will probably take me twice as long. All right, next question. Will a mature cutting go back to juvenile? So I spoke about this in a little bit more detail in my Monstera dubius plant spotlight, but basically in a nutshell, I think there's like 4 things to consider. Number 1 is how mature is your cutting, or basically how thick is the stem of your cutting. Number 2, how many leaves do we have? Because each leaf is able to provide the plant with energy through photosynthesis. And number 3 is how many roots do we have available? The plant needs a root system to sustain itself, provide the plant with water and nutrients. And then the last one is, of course, are the conditions changing? So if you grow a large species in like an amazing environment and it grows to maturity, you take a cutting and then you pop it in a dark corner, of course it's not going to continue to mature. If your cutting has no root system, of course it's going to revert back to juvenile. It has no root system to provide any of the leaves with water and nutrients. Why would it throw out a huge leaf that it can't actually support? That makes no sense, right? A plant's DNA is all about survival. That plant wants to survive. Throwing out a huge leaf just because you like the look of it has no benefit to the plant. So it's going to start small again, but if you start from a larger cutting, so pretty much the larger the stem of your cutting, the larger the leaves will be that pop out once it starts growing again. But basically, if you want to prevent your plant from reverting, you want to take a big cutting, not just a single node cutting. You want to take a big cutting with a lot of leaves, so a lot of leaves can produce a lot of energy for the plant, so the plant can continue to mature. But you need to make sure that the big cutting also has sufficient roots to sustain that big cutting. If you take a large cutting of, let's say, 10 leaves, but no roots, well, the plant is actually going to drop all of these leaves in favor of re-establishing a root system first. So take a large cutting, but the root system needs to be proportional to the large cutting, and then don't change its environment, right? Keep giving it that nice, beautiful light, because light is pretty much the main thing that makes your plants grow large. Next question. Wow, they all seem to be almost leading to each other, almost like I planned this. How do you manage for your plants on moss pots to continuously grow larger leaves, even though you don't have the best humidity? First of all, I don't have the best humidity. It's probably going to be offensive to some people that live in actually really dry countries. I'm pretty blessed over here in Sydney with quite a bit of humidity, but it can drop down to 30, it can go up to 90. I don't control the humidity. I don't supplement the humidity through humidifiers. I just rely on the natural humidity here in Sydney. So first of all, I'm pretty lucky, and I know that there's other people in other parts of the country, there's other people in other parts of not just the country, but also the world that aren't quite as lucky with that amount of natural humidity. So when we speak about low humidity, I'm saying the humidity is low compared to the natural environment that these plants would normally grow in, like a rainforest with 90-ish% humidity. But compared to other people's indoor environments, my humidity is probably at the upper end. Now, it's still not optimal conditions if you compare them to its natural environment, but I don't think humidity is necessarily one of the most important factors that contribute to your plants maturing. In order for your plants to mature, I think you really need 3 things, or like 3 main things, which is light, food, and room/support. So your plants need to get access to enough light so that your plant can actually produce enough energy to grow. Your plant, if it's I'm assuming it's a climber and it climbs up a moss pole, that naturally tells the plant to mature. That is how the plant grows in nature. And the third thing, of course, you need to feed that plant. You need to provide that plant with nutrients so it can actually take these nutrients and convert into plant growth. So if you're hitting these 3 things, then you should be able to mature your plants in an indoor setting, even though you might not have the conditions that the plants would normally have in nature. Now, humidity is probably one of the hardest parts in an indoor setting because we also don't want to ruin our apartments, right? So I don't use humidifiers for exactly that reason, but I compensate with it by giving the plants a moss pole to grow on. So in nature, if it's 90% humidity, these aerial roots will just go crazy and will actually provide a lot of benefits to the plants. In an indoor setting, if the humidity can drop down to 30%, for example, these aerial roots will just shrivel up. And there's just not enough humidity for them to actually make any difference to the plants. So I give them the moss pole so that the aerial roots can actually grow into the moss pole and turn into proper water roots, becoming part of the larger root system that then helps the plant absorb more water and nutrients that it needs for the growth and so on. Is adding a liquid nutrient into the moss when making the poles beneficial? Technically, yes. If you provide the moss if you put nutrients in the moss, then once the roots grow into the moss pole, they can take advantage of these nutrients. I personally don't do it. I think it would just be a waste of nutrients, because when I actually make the moss poles and I wet the moss, I soak it first and then I get rid of any excess water. I don't want the moss to be wet. I want it to be moist. So you would basically just, put a lot of liquid nutrients down the drain. Ultimately, once I make the moss pole and I pop them on the plant, then I water it with a liquid nutrient solution anyway. So at the latest, by then, the nutrients will be provided. So you can totally do it. It makes sense. But if it actually makes any difference, I doubt it. Are you wasting some of your fertilizer? Definitely. All right, I really like this question. Lifetime of your moss. Growing medium should be exchanged. So how do you deal with this, and do you reuse moss? Basically what this person is saying, that eventually the moss in my moss pole is going to get a little bit yucky, it will decompose, it will not have the same water retention capacity anymore, and so on. So I should really change the medium in my, how you repot your plant, because the medium comes a little bit old. I should technically do the same with my moss poles. Now, I don't do that. First of all, I don't think it's actually really possible to take the moss pole apart and change the moss in the moss pole. That moss pole is full of roots. If you try to change the moss around in that moss pole, you would basically just destroy all of the root system. So if for some reason you need to take that moss pole apart, I would actually take the plant and I cut it into single node cuttings and then start on a fresh moss pole. Now, I've been using moss poles for almost 3 years now, and I think I don't actually have a moss pole that is 3 years old though, because the way that I grow my plants with my chop and extend method, I have a plant growing on a moss pole, it grows up, I extend it, it grows up that extension, I then chop it and I take the extension, I pot it back up and then I re-extend the extension. So always keep using the top part of the moss pole, meaning that I always use the newest part of the pole, the newest part of the growth. Then that bottom part, yes, I sometimes sell, I swap, I chop up into single node cuttings, but that bottom part, even if you'd extend that again, then it will just climb back up that extension and then you end up with that top again. So that bottom part is eventually not useful anymore anyway. The leaves on that bottom part will eventually fade, right? No leaf has a lifespan of 2 to 3 years, or at least not in my environment. So the moss pole will at least outlive the actual plant that's growing on that moss pole. So I haven't had any issues with the moss pole becoming old, or me having to change the medium in the moss pole, because the whole chop and extend process takes care of that for me. And yes, if I take a moss pole apart because I chopped it into single node cuttings, I totally reuse the moss if I think it still has sufficient water retention capacity. Next question, do you buy well-rooted cuttings or wet sticks? I buy a variety of plants. I definitely try and buy rooted plants where possible. I just had too many plants die on me, right? Like, that is the trickiest part. That's the part where things can go wrong, where you introduce a new plant to your environment. It's gone through some shock because it was chopped, potentially shipped to you, and so on. That establishing of that plant in your environment, that's the tricky part, and that's where 90% of my plants die. Once they're established and they're here, like, I'm having an easy time keeping them alive. It's just really getting them used to my environment first. And sometimes, honestly, there's nothing that you can do. That plant is just not meant to be, and it's gonna die on you. So if you've had that happen to you, don't hate on you, don't be afraid. It happens to everybody. I literally just got a Monstera escalodo and it died on me within a month, right? So it came with root rot and it was never able to recover from that. So, it's unfortunate, but I'm not going to beat myself up over it. There's nothing, it doesn't make me any more or less of a plant parent or a plant expert or whatever you might call yourself, right? Like, it's totally normal. We're dealing with nature over here. Now, I try and stay away from wet sticks. If I do get wet sticks, then really just through like a swap, or, if a friend gives me a cutting for free, I don't mind taking a wet stick, but I wouldn't necessarily pay for a wet stick because you don't know if it will ever reshoot. Specifically, if you're After variegated plants, if you just buy a wet stick, you don't even know if this plant is going to show variegation or if the variegation is viable, right? I've had way too many cuttings go all green or all white, so I would never buy a variegated wet stick. But if it's just a non-variegated plant and I feel confident with it and it's not too expensive, then yep, I would consider getting a wet stick. But yeah, I would definitely recommend always buy plants that have at least a bit of a root system, just so that root system can also sustain that plant while being shipped to you and can help the plant re-establish itself in your environment. And I would always make sure it has a little growth point as well, just to ensure that it is actually able to grow. Right? And then once you get those plants, they will kind of really kickstart in your environment pretty quickly. Which leads me to the next question. Damn, I plant as well. How long does it take to grow out a wet stick, or how long does it take for a plant to root into the moss pole? How long does it take for a plant to reach that size, and so on? So I get many questions of people asking for very specific timeframes on how long things take. Well, first of all, that really depends on the plant itself. You can have two completely different species that will grow very differently, that will have very different speeds in growing. So I can't give you a number. I can't tell you that, yep, if you get a wet sticks without roots, within 2 months, you will for sure have roots. I've had wet sticks in water for 5 months and nothing happened, and eventually I gave up on them, right? But I've also had wet sticks in water for a week and I started seeing roots. It really depends on just that one specific cutting. Obviously, it's based on the species as well. Some species are easier than others, but even two of the same species could have completely different time frames in rooting and so on. Same goes with growing a plant on a moss pole. If you put a plant on a moss pole and it already has a decent root system, it's going to grow pretty quickly, and then with each new node, that node will start attaching to the moss pole. If you have a plant that has a very small root system, you pop it on a moss pole, it might spend the first couple of months just growing roots first, like down in the pot, doesn't even grow any new leaves. So there is no new leaves to attach to the moss pole, new nodes to attach to the moss pole. So I can't give you a time frame. Growing plants is not a sprint. It's definitely a marathon. So don't get too caught up about specific timings or like, you know, oh, my plant is like 3 months old. It should be bigger by now. It should have rooted by now. Just give it time and good luck. Next question. Due to water retention, do moss poles increase the chances of root rot, mold, or pests? Not in my experience. Yes, moss has quite a large water retention capacity, but the moss poles that I construct are just made from wire mesh. So they also have a really large surface area, meaning that the moss actually dries out quite quickly and has access to plenty of airflow. So I personally have not experienced any issues with mold, pests, or root rot within the moss pole itself. If I have any of these issues, it's usually coming from the potting medium, and funnily enough, never the potting medium of my plants in a moss pole. It's always my crawling philodendron. It seems to be something with me and crawling philodendron that just don't get along. So I'd say no, but I think it also really depends on the quality of sphagnum moss that you put in your moss poles in the first place. Again, I'm pretty lucky over here in Australia. We've got a premium quality sphagnum moss brand called Brunnings. It's sold at Bunnings, and it's also sustainably harvested. So that's all good to go, and it's really good quality, and I haven't really experienced any issues with that. If you maybe get a bad batch of moss, or maybe that moss wasn't really dried completely before they stored it, and then you get it like a few months later when you re-wet it, there might be like fungus in there already that's then just coming back to life. Doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. You got your sphagnum moss with mold and pests in it already potentially. I think that's usually what goes wrong, because I do get these questions quite a bit online and I haven't really experienced them myself. So I don't necessarily think it has anything to do with your care. I think it would have everything to do with the actual material in itself. Honestly, if you cannot make it work with moss, try cocoa chips. So they are like somewhere between, like cocoa peat is way too fine. Cocoa coir is also way too stringy, doesn't really have water retention capacity. But if you use cocoa chips, so like little chunks of coconut, they actually have a bit of water retaining capacity and they're pretty inexpensive, so you can use them. But keep in mind, they're really messy in an indoor environment. They're not really, and they don't have as much water retaining capacity, so you actually need to water it more often than your moss. Next question, would a shorter moss pole affect a plant's ability to mature? It depends on which plant you're growing. If your plant is growing with small internodal spacing, so it doesn't need a whole lot of room to actually grow to mature, then no, not necessarily. If you have a plant that grows with very large internodal spacing, like a philodendron verrucosum, for example, then of course, if you give it a small moss pole and it can only grow like 2 leaves on a moss pole before it reaches the top, then yeah, you're not going to get the full benefit out of it if you just gave 2 leaves, a moss pole, and the rest is just hanging mid-air, which basically means that if you want to keep your moss pole shorter, but you still want the plant to continue growing up that moss pole, you will just have to chop and extend like all the time. With every chop and extend, you're setting back the plant at least a little bit. Even if we can reduce the shock through the moss pole in itself, you're still giving it a bit of a setback. So the longer you can keep the plant from being chopped, or the longer the period in between chop and extends, the easier for the plant to actually mature. So I would, consider that when making a choice on how large your moss poles should be. I just give all of my plants a 90 centimeter moss pole because I know that they will eventually grow up the whole 90 centimeter moss pole. So I might as well just give it to them now. If you don't like the look of really long, tall moss poles and you want a plant that isn't climbing very fast, I can highly recommend Philodendron Soleroy or Philodendron Majestic. They're both not climbing really fast. Next one, when your plants reach a desired maturity, do you continue chop and extending, or do you just cut the top off to keep it at a manageable height? First of all, define desired maturity. I feel like you can always get larger. So look, I don't have a desired maturity or a desired look for my plants. I understand that my plants are living organisms and that they will change at all times. So I don't have a specific goal that I want to hit, and then once I hit it, then like the journey is the goal. But basically what you're trying to ask is like, if you want to maintain the plant as it is, you don't want it to change, you like the look of it right now, but obviously the plant is going to continue to grow. What do? You could totally just keep chopping the top off, but keep in mind that the leaves at the bottom will eventually deteriorate and drop. So you will eventually end up with like a moss pole that is just empty at the bottom half, and then the top half has all of the leaves, but these leaves will also eventually deteriorate. So if you continuously just chopping the top, you could do that, but I would then encourage you to take the top, propagate it and put it back into the bottom of the pot so that you can have new growth at the bottom of the pot as well. I personally think that is way more work than just continuously chop and extending it. I also don't mind doing the chop and extend because honestly the plant gets better light once I chop it and the big leaves are at the bottom of the pot, right? Of course, with light coming in from your windows and having a ceiling, the bottom, like any plant growing closer to the floor will always have more access to light than as it grows up, which is actually the opposite of what happens in nature. So I think chop and extending is actually the only way for your plants to continue mature or continue to grow and continue to look nice. Next question, why don't you grow plant blank? Fill in the gap. So I get that asked a lot. People are like, hey, I'm growing this and this plant. Why don't you grow this plant? I would love to see what it looks like when it grows to maturity. Hey, have you grown this plant to maturity? Hey, can you send me a photo of this plant? I really want to see what it looks like when it's mature. Now, I take it as a compliment. You guys think that I can take any plant in my apartment and it will just grow absolutely ginormous. And that is probably a possibility if I would have unlimited space, right? If I have unlimited space that I can use for amazing plant growth, then yeah, why wouldn't I get all the species in the world and try and grow them all to maturity? That's unrealistic. First of all, it would be extremely overwhelming, but also, well, I live in an apartment. It has walls, and that is essentially the limitations that I've got. Plus, I don't have as much light available as there would be in nature. Like for indoor growing, I have quite a lot of light, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm still very, very limited because of the ceiling. So I need to be really, really mindful with what plants I actually get, and I need to really prioritize which plants I want to see mature. In the previous video, I even just mentioned like my Monstera dubia. It used to be like really close to the window and it continuously matured. But the plant behind it, the Cebu Blue, was not really maturing in the way that I wanted to because it was shaded by the dubia right in front of it. So I swapped them around and then the Cebu Blue started maturing like crazy. But the dubia went back in size, right? So these are just two plants where I really need to choose which one I want to see mature, which one I want to see grow larger leaves, and which one do I want to just keep at maintenance level, really. So imagine I then add another 20 plants to that. Well, I still only have that one really good spot for the plant, and now I have 19 other plants that are competing for that spot. Just makes my life much harder, and I'll probably just end up rearranging every 2 days, which then ends up making the plants unhappy because their environment changes too often. So basically, in a nutshell, I am really picky with the plants that I actually choose to buy, grow, and then even out of those, I'm really picky with which ones I really want to see mature. Oh, I wanted to make this short. I feel like honestly, I can sell ice to the Eskimos. Next question, when did you start growing plants? Tell us a little more about your journey. Now, I can't really exactly remember when I started growing plants, but almost like a bit of a sad story. So Brad used to have a brother as well. His brother is called Max. And they used to live in a house, and they were roaming around the garden and the neighborhood a little bit. Now, unfortunately, Max had a car accident and didn't make it. So Max, I believe, passed away in April 2018, and Max was pretty much the reason I was not able to have any indoor plants because he really just liked nibbling on them. And I know that most of these plants, or pretty much all of the plants you can see behind me, are toxic to pets. Now, Brad is an absolute angel and doesn't care about plants. He really only cares about food that comes in like a little tin. So once Max died, I was able to actually get a few plants and keep them inside without having to worry about my cat. So a bit of a sad story, but I think that's really what kickstarted my indoor plant journey, because I was now finally able to actually have plants indoors. And then it really just, you know, went from there. So it's been over 3 years now. I'll pop in a photo of my entire plant collection and the date that I took it. Yeah, that was like in my little windowsill, and I was over the moon with it, and I thought I was I was like, oh my God, I have so many plants. Little did I know how it's gonna escalate. But honestly, I enjoyed every stage of my journey so far. I know what it was like 3 years ago when I first started, and I get all of these tiny plants, and then you go online and you see everybody with these huge plants online. I was like, oh my God, I will never get there. And I feel like I got there. So honestly, like if I can do it, you can all do it as well. You just need to be really patient, and you need to be very, very consistent, right? Like I do make my plants a priority, and I have been making plants a priority over the last 3 years, right? Like you're not going to end up with a jungle behind you if you just bank on plants that thrive on neglect. I mean, you can, but then it's not going to look like this. It's going to look like you live in a farm of snake plants. Pretty much right up from the start, I really started liking aeroids, and I started growing plants on moss poles about 3 years ago. And I think that moss pole technique and like growing them up and then chopping, extending them, I feel like that really, I really like that, because I felt like, oh, this is like a forever approach, right? It's like a forever thing. I just keep chopping and extending. So I really just like that idea behind it and that vision behind it, and knowing that my plants can grow like that indefinitely until I can't be asked anymore. So I really wanted to make it work, and I really wanted to kind of perfect that approach. So yeah, and it kind of just snowballed into suddenly like plants are part of your interior design, are part of your apartment. Any corner without a plant suddenly looks super empty, so you get more plants. And you know, so it was a very gradual journey over those 3 years, though. It wasn't like one day I had no plants and the next day I had 100, right? It was really just slowly adding more and more plants into my collection, slowly getting into different genus that are supposedly a little bit trickier and so on. So really making all of these learnings along the way. I feel like 3 years ago when I started, yes, there was some resources available online that you can refer back to, but nothing compared to the amount of resources that are out there these days. So yeah, happy days. It's a good time to join the hobby for sure. Leading me to the next question, what are some of the oldest plants in your collection? The oldest plants that I still have are probably my Adansonii over here, subspecies Laniata, my Siltepecana El Salvador, and my Gloriosum. I think those are probably the oldest ones that I still have in my collection. I've got like a trio star out on the balcony that I'm looking at right now. That's definitely over 3 years old as well, but it just lives on the balcony, so it never really got an opportunity to really thrive. It's not really one of like the plants I like. Pretty much most of the plants that I have made a spotlight about, those are some of my older plants because I've, you know, gathered enough experience to actually start talking about them. What's the point in buying a plant from a plant shop, sitting down and telling you all about the plant care for a plant that you haven't even taken care of yet? So all of my plant spotlights are pretty much about the plants that have been with me for a long time, since the beginning of my journey, or the plants that have been with me and they're still here. Definitely a lot of plants that I started off with, like a few pothos, a few like heart-shaped philodendron, they just, you know, eventually had to leave because, yeah, other plants took priority. Sorry. All right, we're almost done. How do you clean your leaves? I just spray them with water. That's it. I take them to the balcony or the bathtub and I spray them. I have way too many plants to go around and wipe every single leaf. Also, by the way, in nature, that's exactly how it works. There's rain in nature and that just cleans the leaves. There's nobody in nature going through the rainforest like wiping them all. So, help! I can't stop buying plants. What do you do to help yourself? Quality over quantity. I don't need to buy another plant to give me that instant gratification. I much rather grow a plant and get my instant gratification from continuously seeing new leaves pop up everywhere. So probably not as instant because you need to actually grow it, but it is more a long-term gratification rather than that short-term gratification you get when you just buy a new plant. So next time you're at the plant store and you see that plant, think about, do you really need that plant? And is that plant still going to spark you joy in a month's time? Is it just sparking you joy right now because it's new and fancy and you want to get it right now? But are you going to forget about it in a month's time? I usually buy plants that when I get them, they don't even spark me joy because they're still so tiny and they're not necessarily what I want. I want to grow that plant into a larger specimen. So the moment I actually get the plant is the least satisfying moment. But once I start growing it and they start growing in my environment and they're giving me leaves in my environment, that's where really the results kick in, and that's where really that's the part that I'm looking forward to. So I would really just focus on quality over quantity. Don't overcompensate for the lack of growth your other plants have by buying another plant. Really try and understand, why are your existing plants not growing and what can you do about them? And that will be much more satisfying than just buying new plants and killing them on a daily. And the last one, people want to learn a little bit more about me as a person. So I think I get this question probably under every video. They ask me, what the hell is happening with my accent and why do I sound like I'm South African, German, French and Australian all at the same time? Well, it's because I actually grew up in Germany. I was born there and I grew up there, and I only moved to Australia 10 years ago. So obviously that German accent is probably here to stay, but given that I've lived in Australia for 10 years and I predominantly speak English over here, I don't speak much German while I'm here, only with my family. So yeah, of course, eventually I start picking up a bit of an Australian accent as well, because in Australia is really where I learned to speak most of my English. So my accent isn't so influenced by watching movies and so on. It's more influenced obviously by the people that surround me. I have lots of interests. Plants have definitely taken over most of my hobbies over the last few years. So a few things had to take a step back in favor of making enough time for the plants, but I love being physically active. I played tennis my whole life. I stopped playing tennis kind of when I came to Australia, unfortunately, just because I didn't really know anybody over here, but I'm slowly starting to pick that up again. And yeah, outside of tennis, I love to go running. I love to go to the gym, but I mainly do body weight workouts. Like I love calisthenics and handstands and that sort of stuff. So definitely always really interested in, you know, my body and the way that the body functions and, you know, making your body healthy and make myself feel good in the body that I'm in. So I've also been focusing a lot on just stretching rather than just pumping iron. Like I've moved away from that stage. So these days it's all about mobility, flexibility, and really training movements rather than training muscle groups. I've always been a really creative person. My creative outlet has always been photography. So even as a little kid, I had a camera. I bought my first DSLR from my own pocket money when I was 12. And I just started doing like random photo shoots with friends or by myself. So I've always been a really creative person. I try to like do, you know, back in Facebook times, I always try to have like some funky profile photos where I like edit myself in like flying around. I'll try and find a few photos and pop them on screen in case you're interested. And then eventually I also had a drone, and I did a bit of landscape photography with my drone. I pop in a few photos over here as well. Those are also the photos that you see hanging in my apartment. So any of these prints, they're actually my own prints. I am a big animal lover. I also don't eat them. I think that kind of goes hand in hand. So I've been vegetarian I turned vegetarian in 2014. And I turned vegan in 2017. So it's been 5 years of being plant-based at this stage. And, you know, I couldn't feel any better or happier. So I think it was really something that always came really natural to me anyway. I was never a big meat eater, even when I was a child. So once I really started doing my research, I feel like there was absolutely nothing holding me back from going vegan. That was really just the only step that made sense to me. I do have a full-time job. So plants is just my hobby and my passion. I have a full-time office job. I work in financial services in the more like operations management aspect of financial services. And I really love it. I've always been a very academic person. I love my studies. I studied business management. I really loved going to uni. I loved learning about all of these things, and it's definitely something I want to pick up again and maybe start doing a master as well. So I really love my academics. I really love my sports, but I also really love my creative aspects. And plants are really just my latest creative outlet. And of course, content creation for social media is also a nice creative outlet I have these days. So, I mean, this channel is really all about plants, but I appreciate that you guys want to learn a little bit about me as well, given that you might be watching me for hours. So, you know, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope all of my answers made sense, and I hope you got some value out of this video. I would really appreciate if you could like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment if you did enjoy this video. Please also feel free to check out my Q&A part 1 and my Q&A part number 2. And, you know, I think by now I've pretty much answered all the questions that are out there, but I'm sure we're going to come up with a new set of questions in the next episode. So check out my community page. I'll pop something on there, you know, every couple of months, giving you the opportunity to ask me any questions. All right, bye-bye, take care.